The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the weathered church in Prescott, Arizona Territory, and Caroline Whitmore pressed her trembling fingers against the dusty window, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst clean through her chest as she caught her first glimpse of the tall cowboy waiting on the church steps, hat in hand, looking every bit as terrified as she felt. It was April of 1882, and the desert sun beat down mercilessly on the small frontier town, casting everything in shades of amber and gold. Caroline had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia, answering an advertisement that had seemed like divine providence 3 months ago when her aunt's boarding house had burned to the ground, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a future as uncertain as morning fog. The advertisement had been simple and direct, placed by a cattle rancher named James McAllister, who needed a wife to help manage his household and perhaps, one day, to share his life with in a more meaningful way. The correspondence had been brief but kind. His letters spoke of a man who worked hard, who valued honesty and compassion, who had built something substantial from nothing but grit and determination. He had sent her enough money for passage and new clothes, asking only that she come with an open heart and a willingness to try. She had written back promising both, never mentioning the nightmares that plagued her sleep or the way her hands shook whenever she thought about standing before God and man to pledge herself to a stranger. The stagecoach driver opened the door, his weathered face creasing into a smile that held more kindness than pity. "Here we are, Miss Prescott, Arizona Territory. Your intended is waiting right over there by the church. That's James McAllister, one of the finest men in these parts if you ask me." Caroline tried to smile, tried to make her legs work properly as she accepted his hand and stepped down onto the dusty street. Her traveling dress, a modest gray affair with black trim, was coated in a fine layer of red dust, despite her best efforts to keep clean during the journey. Her dark hair, pinned carefully that morning in Flagstaff, had come loose in several places, and she knew she must look a fright. Not at all like the composed young woman whose photograph she had sent to James 3 months ago. James McAllister descended the church steps slowly, as if approaching a skittish horse. He was taller than she had imagined, probably well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean build of a man who spent his days working under the sun. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and his eyes were a startling shade of blue that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed composure. He looked to be perhaps 28 or 30 years old, his face tanned and weathered but handsome in a rugged, honest way. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice deep and gentle, with a slight drawl that marked him as a man who had spent time in Texas before settling in Arizona. "I am glad you arrived safely. The journey must have been difficult." Caroline opened her mouth to respond, to say something polite and appropriate, but no words came out. Instead, she felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, hot and unwelcome. She blinked rapidly, trying to force them back, trying to summon the courage that had carried her across half a continent. "I am sorry," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am just tired from the journey." James nodded slowly, his blue eyes filled with understanding rather than judgment. "Of course. Would you like to rest before we proceed? I have taken a room for you at the hotel. You can freshen up, perhaps have something to eat." The kindness in his voice made the tears threaten to spill over even more insistently. Caroline shook her head, forcing steel into her spine. "No, I am fine. You have made all these arrangements, gathered all these people. We should proceed as planned." It was true that a small crowd had gathered near the church. Caroline could see several women in their Sunday best, a handful of men in clean shirts and pressed trousers, and the minister himself standing in the doorway with his Bible clutched in both hands. They had all come to witness this union, to welcome a new member into their community. She could not disappoint them, could not disappoint James, who had shown her nothing but consideration and respect. James offered his arm and Caroline took it, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the fabric of his coat. He smelled of leather and sage and something clean and masculine that was not unpleasant. They walked together toward the church, their footsteps crunching on the dry ground, and Caroline tried to focus on breathing, on putting one foot in front of the other, on anything except the rising panic that threatened to swallow her whole. The inside of the church was blessedly cool and dim after the harsh brightness of the Arizona sun. Simple wooden pews lined both sides of a narrow aisle, and wildflowers in mason jars provided the only decoration. It was humble and honest, much like everything else she had seen of this frontier town, and under different circumstances, Caroline might have found it charming. The minister, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying hair, smiled at them both as they approached the altar. "Welcome, my dear. I am Reverend Parker. James has spoken of you often these past months. We are all delighted you have arrived safely." Caroline tried to return his smile but felt her lips trembling with the effort. The small congregation had filed in behind them, filling the first few pews with rustling skirts and whispered conversation. She could feel their eyes on her back, could imagine what they must be thinking. The mail-order bride from back east, probably desperate and homely, probably grateful to catch any man at all. "Shall we begin?" Reverend Parker asked gently, opening his Bible to a marked page. James glanced at Caroline, and she saw concern flickering in those blue eyes. She nodded quickly, not trusting her voice, and the Reverend began to speak the ancient words that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The words washed over Caroline like water, familiar and foreign all at once. She had attended weddings before, had even dreamed of her own when she was younger and more foolish, but she had never imagined it would be like this. Standing beside a stranger in a frontier church, thousands of miles from everything she had ever known, with tears streaming down her face and her whole body shaking with suppressed sobs. She tried to hold them back, truly she did. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, dug her fingernails into her palms, forced herself to breathe slowly and deeply. But the tears kept coming, silent and relentless, tracking through the dust on her cheeks and dripping onto the front of her dress. Her shoulders began to shake with the effort of containing her emotions, and she felt rather than saw James turn to look at her. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," Reverend Parker continued, his voice gentle but steady, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God. Caroline could not stop the sob that escaped her throat, harsh and raw in the quiet church. She pressed her hand to her mouth, horrified by her lack of control, by the scene she was making in front of all these strangers who had come to welcome her. But the tears would not stop, could not be stopped, and suddenly she was weeping openly, her whole body shaking with the force of her grief and fear and exhaustion. She felt James's hand on her shoulder, warm and steady, and heard his voice cutting through the Reverend's recitation. "Wait, please wait a moment, Reverend Parker." The minister fell silent, and Caroline could hear the murmur of confused voices from the pews behind them. She wanted to disappear, wanted the earth to open up and swallow her whole, wanted to be anywhere but here making a spectacle of herself. James turned her gently to face him, his large hands resting on her shoulders. When she could not meet his eyes, he ducked his head slightly, trying to catch her gaze. "Miss Whitmore, Caroline. Look at me, please." She forced herself to lift her head, to meet those steady blue eyes through the blur of her tears. She expected to see anger there, or disappointment, or disgust. Instead, she saw only concern and something that looked almost like understanding. "We do not have to do this today," James said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she and perhaps the Reverend could hear. "We can do this another day. There is no rush, no requirement that we marry this very moment." Caroline shook her head frantically, trying to find words through her tears. "I am sorry, I am so sorry. You have done so much, paid for my passage, made all these arrangements. I am being foolish and weak, I just need a moment." "You are not being foolish," James said firmly, his hands still steady on her shoulders. "You have traveled halfway across the country to marry a man you have never met. Anyone would be overwhelmed. There is no shame in needing more time. But all these people," Caroline whispered, acutely aware of the watching congregation, "they came to witness our wedding." "And they will understand," James said simply. He turned to address the assembled guests, his voice carrying clearly through the small church. "Friends, I am grateful you all came today to support us, but it seems we are going to postpone this ceremony. Miss Whitmore has had a long and difficult journey, and she needs time to rest and recover before we proceed. I hope you will understand and forgive the inconvenience." There was a moment of surprised silence, and then a woman's voice called out from the third pew. "Of course we understand, James. You bring that poor girl to the hotel and get her some food and rest. A wedding can wait." Other voices chimed in with agreement and well wishes, and Caroline felt a fresh wave of tears threatening. But these were different somehow, tinged with gratitude rather than despair. James offered his arm again, and this time she took it gladly, letting him guide her back down the aisle and out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The crowd dispersed slowly, with several women stopping to press Caroline's hand and offer words of encouragement. A plump woman with friendly eyes and gray-streaked brown hair introduced herself as Martha Henderson, the doctor's wife. "You come by tomorrow when you are feeling better, dear. I will have some fresh bread and jam, and we can have a proper visit." James thanked everyone for their understanding and led Caroline down the dusty street toward a two-story building with a painted sign proclaiming it the Prescott Hotel. The proprietor, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, greeted them with a nod. "Your room is ready, Miss Whitmore. Second floor, first door on the right. I will have some hot water sent up so you can wash." "Thank you, Mr. Jameson," James said, pressing some coins into the man's hand. "And perhaps some tea and sandwiches as well, if you would be so kind." Caroline let James escort her up the narrow staircase to a small but clean room with a bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the street. He set her carpetbag on the chair near the bed and turned to face her, his expression serious but kind. "I want you to know that you are under no obligation to proceed with this marriage," James said carefully. "If you have changed your mind, if you find you cannot go through with it, I will purchase you a ticket back to Philadelphia or wherever else you wish to go. You will not be stranded here against your will." Caroline felt tears threatening again, but this time she managed to hold them back. "You are very kind. More kind than I deserve after the scene I just caused." "You did nothing wrong," James said firmly. "I should have realized that going straight from the stagecoach to the church was too much. I was thinking only of logistics, not of how overwhelming this must be for you." He moved toward the door but paused with his hand on the knob. "I am going to leave you to rest now. There is a lock on this door. Use it. Get some sleep, have something to eat, and we can talk tomorrow when you are feeling better. My ranch is about 5 miles outside of town, but I will take a room here at the hotel tonight, so you will know where to find me if you need anything. Mr. McAllister," Caroline said, her voice still shaky but stronger than before. "James, I do want to marry you. I am not having second thoughts about that. I was just overwhelmed and exhausted and frightened, but I came here to build a new life, and I still want that." James studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine the truth of her words. Finally, he nodded. "All right, then we will take things slowly and do this properly. There is no rush." "Get some rest, Caroline." After he left, Caroline sank down onto the bed and let the tears flow freely one more time. But these tears were different, cleansing somehow, releasing all the tension and fear she had been carrying for so long. She cried for everything she had lost in Philadelphia, for the uncertainty of her future, and for the unexpected kindness of the stranger who had just offered her a way out even though it would cost him considerably. When the tears finally stopped, she felt hollowed out but strangely peaceful. A knock at the door announced the arrival of hot water and food, and Caroline washed her face and hands before sitting down to eat. The sandwiches were simple but good, filled with roasted beef and sharp cheese, and the tea was hot and strong. As she ate, she found herself thinking about James McAllister. He was not what she had expected, though she was not entirely sure what she had expected. His letters had been kind but formal, revealing little of his personality beyond the basic facts of his life. He owned a cattle ranch that he had built from nothing over the past 8 years. He had come to Arizona Territory from Texas after serving briefly in the Confederate Army during his youth, though he had been barely more than a boy at the time. He had no family left living, his parents having died of fever when he was 20, his only brother killed in a ranching accident 3 years ago. What his letters had not conveyed was the steadiness of his presence, the calm strength that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a stove. Or the kindness in his eyes when he looked at her crying face and told her they could wait. He could have been angry or disappointed. He could have insisted they proceed despite her tears. Instead, he had put her comfort above his own convenience, above the opinions of his community, above everything else. Caroline finished her meal and lay down on the bed, intending to rest for just a few minutes. But exhaustion claimed her swiftly, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep that lasted well into the evening. She woke to the sound of voices drifting up from the street below, and the sight of stars visible through her window. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was or how she had gotten there. Then memory flooded back, bringing with it a mixture of embarrassment and relief. She had cried at her own wedding. She had sobbed like a child in front of a church full of strangers. And James had stopped the ceremony and brought her here to rest. Caroline rose and lit the oil lamp on the bedside table, then poured water from the pitcher into the basin and washed her face again. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand showed a young woman with dark hair tumbling loose around her shoulders, dark circles under her brown eyes, and a serious expression that made her look older than her 22 years. Not a beauty by any means, but not hideous either. Plain, she supposed, was the kindest word for it. She changed into her nightgown and climbed back into bed, but sleep eluded her now. Instead, she lay awake thinking about everything that had led her to this moment. The fire that had destroyed her aunt's boarding house had taken more than just a building. It had taken Caroline's sense of security, her belief that she could make her own way in the world through hard work and determination. She had been managing the boarding house for her aunt, who was increasingly frail and forgetful, handling everything from the cooking to the accounts. When the fire swept through in the middle of the night, they had escaped with their lives but little else. Her aunt had gone to live with a cousin in New York, but there was no room for Caroline in that household. She had no other family, no close friends who could take her in, no prospects for employment that would pay enough to support herself. The mail-order bride advertisement had appeared in the newspaper 2 days after the fire, and Caroline had responded almost without thinking, driven by desperation and a strange sense that perhaps this was meant to be. Now, lying in a hotel room in Arizona Territory, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. But then she thought of James's kind eyes and steady voice telling her they could wait, and something in her chest loosened just a little. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the Arizona sun streaming through her window with what seemed like excessive enthusiasm. Caroline dressed carefully in her best day dress, a dark blue cotton with white trim, and pinned her hair up properly. She studied her reflection critically, pinched her cheeks to bring some color to them, and decided she looked as presentable as possible under the circumstances. She found James in the hotel dining room, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs and bacon. He stood when he saw her, his face breaking into a smile that transformed his features from merely handsome to genuinely attractive. "Good morning, Caroline. I hope you slept well." "I did, thank you," she said, taking the seat he pulled out for her. "Better than I have in weeks, actually." They ordered breakfast, and for a few minutes they ate in companionable silence. Caroline was acutely aware of the curious glances from other diners, but she tried to ignore them and focus on the excellent food. The eggs were cooked perfectly, the bacon crisp, and the biscuits were fluffy and buttery. "I thought perhaps we could spend the day getting to know each other a bit better," James said, setting down his coffee cup. "If you are feeling up to it, I could show you around town, introduce you to more folks. Or we could take a ride out to the ranch so you can see what would be your home. Or if you would rather just rest and talk, that would be fine too." Caroline considered his words carefully. "I would like to see the ranch, I think. It would help me understand your life better." James smiled again, that warm expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "The ranch it is then. Fair warning, it is not fancy. I have been focused on building up the herd and improving the land, not on making the house pretty." "I did not come here expecting fancy," Caroline said with more confidence than she felt. "I came here to work and to build something." They finished breakfast and walked to the livery stable where James kept his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Copper. He also arranged for a gentle mare for Caroline, a pretty chestnut with a white blaze named Daisy. Caroline had not ridden much in Philadelphia, but she had learned as a girl when visiting relatives in the countryside, and the skills came back to her as they rode out of town and into the open desert landscape. The land here was so different from anything she had known back east. Instead of green hills and dense forests, there were vast stretches of red earth dotted with scrubby bushes and tall saguaro cacti standing like sentinels against the impossibly blue sky. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the warmth of the April sun. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way that took her breath away. "It takes some getting used to," James said, noticing her odd expression. "When I first came here, I thought it was the most desolate place on earth, but it grows on you. There is a beauty in the emptiness, a sense of freedom you do not get back east." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the horses moving at an easy pace. Caroline found herself relaxing in the saddle, enjoying the warmth of the sun on her face and the endless expanse of sky overhead. James pointed out landmarks as they went. A rocky outcropping that marked the northern boundary of his property, a dry creek bed that flowed with water during the summer monsoons, a stand of cottonwood trees that provided precious shade for cattle during the hot months. After about an hour of riding, they crested a low rise, and Caroline saw the ranch spread out below them. It was bigger than she had expected, with a main house built of adobe and wood, a large barn, several corrals, and various outbuildings she could not identify. Cattle dotted the landscape, grazing contentedly on the sparse vegetation. "It is not much," James said, and she could hear both pride and self-consciousness in his voice. "But it is mine, built with my own hands and paid for with honest work." "It is wonderful," Caroline said sincerely. "You should be proud of what you have accomplished." They rode down to the ranch house, and James helped her dismount before leading both horses to the barn. A young man emerged from one of the outbuildings, wiping his hands on his pants. He was perhaps 20 years old, with sandy hair and a friendly, open face. "Miss Whitmore, this is Tom Harris, my ranch hand. Tom, this is Caroline Whitmore from Philadelphia." Tom pulled off his hat and bobbed his head in a respectful nod. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am. James has talked about nothing but your arrival for weeks now." James gave him a quelling look, but there was no real heat in it. "Thank you, Tom. Could you take care of the horses while I show Miss Whitmore around?" "Sure thing, boss." The house was simple but solidly built, with thick adobe walls that kept the interior cool despite the heat outside. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large fireplace dominating one wall and a sturdy wooden table in the center. 2 doors led off this main room, presumably to bedrooms. "I know it is not what you are used to," James said, watching her face carefully. "But it is comfortable enough, and there is room to expand if needed." Caroline walked slowly around the room, taking in the details. The furniture was handmade but well-crafted. The shelves held a surprising number of books. The kitchen area was clean and organized, though clearly the domain of a man living alone. "It is a good house," she said finally. "It has good bones, as my aunt used to say. It just needs a woman's touch to make it a home." She saw relief flash across James's face, quickly hidden. "I was hoping you would see it that way. I have never been much for decorating and such. I figured that would be your domain if you wanted it." They spent the next few hours at the ranch, with James showing her around the property and explaining how everything worked. He introduced her to the other ranch hand, an older Mexican man named Miguel who spoke limited English but had kind eyes and a gentle smile. He showed her the vegetable garden he had been trying to maintain with limited success, the chicken coop that provided eggs, the root cellar where they stored food, and the workshop where he repaired equipment and made furniture during the winter months when ranch work slowed down. Caroline found herself genuinely interested in everything he showed her. She asked questions about the cattle, about the seasonal rhythms of ranch life, about the challenges of running a business in such a remote location. James answered patiently, seeming pleased by her curiosity. They ate lunch at the big wooden table, simple fare of bread and cheese and cold meat that Miguel had left for them. As they ate, they talked more freely than they had before, the conversation flowing more naturally now that they were away from the curious eyes of the town. "Can I ask you something?" James said, his tone careful. "You do not have to answer if you would rather not." Caroline nodded, setting down her water glass. "Of course. Yesterday at the church, when you were crying. Was it because of me? Because you found me disappointing or frightening?" Caroline was startled by the vulnerability in his voice, the genuine concern in his eyes. "No," she said emphatically. "No, it had nothing to do with you at all. You have been nothing but kind and considerate. I was just overwhelmed by everything. The journey, the strangeness of it all, the reality of what I was doing finally hitting me. I have not been myself since the fire, and I think it all just caught up with me at the worst possible moment." James studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I am glad. I would not want you to be frightened of me. I know I am not much to look at, and I am rough around the edges, but I would never hurt you or force you into anything you did not want." "You are wrong about one thing," Caroline said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "You are actually quite handsome. I thought so the moment I saw you on those church steps." Now it was James's turn to look embarrassed, a flush creeping up his neck. "Well, that is kind of you to say, even if it is not strictly true." They smiled at each other across the table, and Caroline felt something shift between them, some small wall beginning to crumble. They were still strangers in many ways, but perhaps they did not have to remain strangers forever. After lunch, James suggested they ride to a spot he wanted to show her, a place he said was his favorite on the entire ranch. They saddled the horses again and rode west, toward the mountains that rose like purple shadows against the horizon. The afternoon sun was warm but not oppressive, and Caroline found herself enjoying the ride, enjoying James's company, enjoying the sense of possibility that seemed to hover in the desert air. They reached a small canyon where water flowed year-round from a spring hidden among the rocks. Cottonwood and willow trees grew thick along the banks, providing shade and a sense of coolness that was delicious after the open sun. James helped Caroline dismount, and they walked to the edge of the stream, where water burbled over smooth stones worn by countless years of flow. "I come here when I need to think," James said quietly, "or when I need to remember why I chose this life. It is easy to get caught up in the work, in the daily struggles, and forget the beauty that is all around us." Caroline knelt by the stream and trailed her fingers in the cold, clear water. "It is beautiful, peaceful. Thank you for sharing it with me." They sat together on a flat rock near the water's edge, not quite touching but close enough that Caroline could feel the warmth radiating from James's body. They talked about small things and large ones, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. James told her about growing up in Texas, about the war that had shaped his youth, about his decision to leave everything familiar and start over in Arizona territory. Caroline spoke of her parents, both dead before she was 10, of growing up in her aunt's boarding house, of the strange mix of independence and constraint that had defined her life. "I was always taking care of someone else," Caroline said softly, watching the play of sunlight on the water. "My aunt, the boarders, everyone who came through that house looking for a place to stay. I never minded it exactly, but I never felt like I was living my own life either. Does that make sense?" "It does," James said. "I felt that way for a long time too, like I was just going through the motions, surviving but not really living. Building this ranch gave me purpose, but it is lonely out here. I want to share this life with someone, to build something together rather than just existing side by side." Caroline turned to look at him, really look at him, seeing past the handsome face and strong build to the loneliness and hope underneath. "I want that too," she said quietly. "I want to build something real, something that matters. I want to wake up every day with purpose and go to bed every night feeling like I accomplished something worthwhile." "We could do that together," James said, his blue eyes intense on hers. "If you are willing to try. I know we are still strangers, and I know this is not the romantic courtship you might have dreamed of as a girl. But I think we could make a good life together, Caroline. I truly do." "I think so too," Caroline said, and as she spoke the words, she realized they were true. The fear that had paralyzed her yesterday was still there, but it was manageable now, overshadowed by curiosity and hope, and the beginning stirrings of something that might, in time, become affection. They returned to town as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold that seemed too vivid to be real. James left Caroline at the hotel with a promise to return in the morning, and she spent the evening in her room, thinking about everything she had seen and learned that day. Over the next week, they fell into a pattern. James would arrive at the hotel each morning, and they would spend the day together, sometimes in town meeting people, sometimes at the ranch working side by side, sometimes just riding through the desert and talking. Caroline met Martha Henderson properly and spent an afternoon learning about the other women in the community. She met the school teacher, a stern but kind woman named Miss Ellis. She met the general store owner and his wife, the blacksmith, the saloon keeper, and dozens of others whose names and faces began to blur together. Everyone was kind if curious. They asked careful questions about her journey, about her life back east, about her plans for the future. Caroline answered as honestly as she could, trying not to be offended by their obvious interest in her personal business. This was a small community where everyone knew everyone else's affairs, and she was the newcomer who had disrupted a wedding and caused a scene. Of course, they would be curious. But through it all, James was a steady presence at her side, deflecting the pushier questions and making it clear that he would not tolerate any disrespect toward her. Caroline found herself increasingly grateful for his protection, and increasingly drawn to his quiet strength and unassuming kindness. One morning, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, James appeared at the hotel with a serious expression on his face. "I need to go to Tucson for a few days," he said without preamble. "There is a cattle auction, and I need to purchase some new breeding stock. I would like you to come with me if you are willing. It would give us more time together, and you could see more of the territory." Caroline felt a flutter of nervousness at the idea of traveling alone with James, but she pushed it aside. They were betrothed, after all, even if they had not yet married, and she wanted to see more of this strange, beautiful land she had come to. "I would like that," she said. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow morning early. We will take the stage to Tucson, stay for 2 nights, and then return. I will book separate rooms, of course," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Everything will be proper." They left Prescott the next morning just as the sun was rising, boarding a stagecoach that would take them south through some of the most spectacular landscape Caroline had ever seen. They passed through mountains and valleys, crossed rivers and deserts, saw distant ranches and tiny settlements clinging to existence in the harsh environment. James pointed out features of the land, told her stories about the history of the territory, and kept up a running commentary that was both informative and entertaining. They reached Tucson in the late afternoon, tired and dusty but in good spirits. The city was larger than Prescott, more established, with actual streets and substantial buildings that spoke of permanence rather than the temporary feel of frontier settlements. James secured rooms for them at a hotel near the center of town, and they agreed to meet for dinner after they had both had a chance to rest and clean up. Caroline took her time washing away the dust of travel and changing into her second-best dress, a dark green cotton that brought out the brown in her eyes. She pinned her hair up carefully and studied her reflection in the mirror, trying to see herself as James might see her. Still plain, she decided, but perhaps not hopelessly so. James was waiting in the hotel dining room, looking uncomfortable in a clean white shirt and vest. His hair was still damp from washing, slicked back from his face, and Caroline thought again how handsome he was, in a rough-hewn, honest way that she found increasingly appealing. They ordered dinner and talked about the journey, the sights they had seen, the auction scheduled for the next day. But underneath the casual conversation, Caroline could feel something building between them, an awareness that had been growing steadily over the past 2 weeks. They were no longer strangers. They had spent hours together, had shared thoughts and fears and hopes. They had laughed together and worked together and ridden together through the desert. Somewhere along the way, without Caroline quite realizing it was happening, she had begun to care for James McAllister. After dinner, they walked through the streets of Tucson, enjoying the cooler evening air. The town was bustling with activity. Cowboys on horses, families walking together, music spilling from the saloons. James bought her a ribbon from a street vendor, a pretty blue silk that matched her eyes. He said, though Caroline thought her eyes were just brown and nothing special. They paused in front of a church, smaller than the one in Prescott but similar in its simple design. James looked at it for a long moment, then turned to Caroline with an expression she could not quite read. "We could get married here," he said quietly. "Tomorrow, after the auction. There is no one to make a fuss, no crowd to witness. Just us and a minister and God, if you are ready, if you want to." Caroline's heart began to pound, but this time it was not fear that drove the rapid beating. It was anticipation, excitement, a strange sort of joy she had not expected to feel. Yes, she heard herself say. Yes, I think I would like that very much. James's face broke into a wide smile, genuine and unguarded. Really, you are sure? I am sure, Caroline said, and she was. The fear that had paralyzed her in Prescott was gone, burned away by 2 weeks of getting to know this good, kind man who had shown her nothing but patience and respect. She was still nervous, still uncertain about so many things, but she wanted this. She wanted to marry James McAllister and build a life with him in the Arizona desert. They walked back to the hotel hand in hand, a first for them, and paused outside Caroline's door. Thank you, James said softly, for giving me another chance. For not running away after what happened in Prescott. Thank you for understanding why I needed time, Caroline replied. You could have been angry or disappointed, but instead you were kind. That meant everything to me. James lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture so sweet and old-fashioned that Caroline felt tears prick her eyes again. But these were happy tears, hopeful tears, tears of promise rather than despair. The next morning they attended the cattle auction together. Caroline knew nothing about cattle, but she watched with interest as James examined the animals on offer, checked their teeth and hooves, asked questions of the sellers. He was focused and knowledgeable, clearly respected by the other ranchers. He made his purchases with confidence, 3 young bulls and a dozen heifers that he said would improve his herd considerably. After the auction, they ate lunch at a small restaurant, then walked back to the church they had seen the night before. The minister, a young man with an earnest face and a slight accent that suggested he had come from Germany originally, agreed to marry them that very afternoon. Caroline had no flowers, no special dress, no family or friends to witness the event. But as she stood beside James in the quiet church, with only the minister and his wife present, she felt none of the panic that had overwhelmed her in Prescott. Instead, she felt a deep sense of peace, of rightness, as if this was exactly where she was meant to be. The minister spoke the familiar words, and this time Caroline listened to them, really listened, hearing the promises and the hope embedded in the ancient ceremony. When it came time for her to speak her vows, her voice was clear and steady. I, Caroline, take you, James, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. James's vows were equally steady, his blue eyes locked on hers as he promised to honor and protect her for the rest of his life. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her gently, chastely, a sweet brush of lips that nevertheless sent warmth flooding through Caroline's entire body. They signed the marriage certificate and thanked the minister and his wife, then walked out into the afternoon sunshine as husband and wife. James was grinning like a boy, and Caroline found herself laughing, giddy with relief and joy and the sheer improbability of it all. We did it, James said, swinging her hand between them. We actually did it. You are Caroline McAllister now. I am, Caroline said, testing out the sound of her new name. Mrs. James McAllister. It has a nice ring to it. They took their time walking back to the hotel, in no particular hurry now that the deed was done. They stopped for an early dinner at the nicest restaurant in Tucson, a place with white tablecloths and candles on the tables. James ordered champagne, a luxury Caroline had only tasted once before in her life, and they toasted to their future together. As the evening wore on, Caroline felt nervousness beginning to creep back in. They were married now, which meant there were expectations, marital duties that she knew about only in the vaguest terms. Her aunt had attempted to explain what happened between husbands and wives, but the explanation had been so vague and euphemistic that Caroline was not entirely sure what to expect. James seemed to sense her growing anxiety. When they returned to the hotel, he walked her to her room and paused outside the door. "Caroline, I want you to know that nothing has to change tonight if you are not ready. We are married now, yes, but we can take things as slowly as you need. There is no rush." Caroline looked up at him, this man who was now her husband, and felt a rush of affection for his consideration. "You are very kind," she said softly, "but we are married now and I am not afraid." "Not of you." James smiled and opened her door, following her inside and closing it behind them. The room was dim, lit only by the lamp she had left burning, and suddenly the space seemed very small with both of them in it. They stood facing each other, neither quite sure how to proceed. Then James reached out and gently pulled the pins from Caroline's hair, letting the dark mass tumble down around her shoulders. "I have been wanting to do that since the first moment I saw you," he said quietly. "Your hair is beautiful," Caroline laughed shakily. "It is just plain brown hair, nothing special." "It is special to me," James said, running his fingers through the silky strands. "Everything about you is special to me." He kissed her then, not the chaste brush of lips from the church, but a real kiss, deep and searching. Caroline kissed him back, tentatively at first and then with growing confidence, her arms coming up to circle his neck. His hands rested on her waist, warm and steady through the fabric of her dress. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. James rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure about this, Caroline? We can still wait if you need more time." "I am sure," Caroline whispered. "I want this, I want you." What followed was tender and awkward and sweet, two people learning each other in the most intimate way possible. James was patient and gentle, clearly experienced enough to guide Caroline through the unfamiliar territory. There was some discomfort, some uncertainty, but there was also pleasure and warmth and a growing sense of connection that went deeper than mere physical joining. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow hotel bed, Caroline's head resting on James's chest as he stroked her hair. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "I did not hurt you, did I?" "I am fine," Caroline said, and she was surprised to find it was true. "Better than fine. That was not at all what I expected. What did you expect?" "I am not entirely sure," Caroline admitted with a laugh. "My aunt's explanation was very unclear, but I am glad my first time was with you." James tightened his arms around her. "I am glad too. More glad than I can say." They returned to Prescott 2 days later, and the news of their marriage spread quickly through the small town. Martha Henderson threw them a party to celebrate, inviting half the town to her home for cake and dancing. Caroline met more people in one evening than she could possibly remember, but everyone was kind and welcoming, genuinely happy for them. Life at the ranch settled into a rhythm after that. Caroline threw herself into making the house a home, sewing curtains for the windows, planting flowers near the door, organizing the kitchen to her liking. She learned to cook for ranch hands, preparing large meals that could fuel men through long days of hard work. She learned to preserve food, to manage the household accounts, to handle a rifle well enough to protect the chickens from coyotes. James taught her to ride better, to recognize the signs of sick cattle, to read the weather in the shape of clouds and the feel of the wind. They worked side by side during the day and fell into each other's arms at night, their initial awkwardness giving way to genuine passion and deep affection. Summer came, bringing intense heat and the monsoon rains that James had told her about. The desert transformed during these storms, turning briefly green as dormant plants burst into life. Caroline stood on the porch during the first big storm, watching lightning split the sky and rain pour down in sheets, and felt more alive than she ever had in Philadelphia. She made friends among the ranch wives and town women, women who taught her the skills she needed to survive in this harsh environment. Martha Henderson became a particular friend, often riding out to the ranch for visits. "Miss Ellis," the schoolteacher, invited Caroline to help with the younger students, and Caroline discovered she had a talent for teaching reading. By autumn, Caroline felt like she had lived in Arizona her entire life. The routines of ranch life were second nature now, and she could read the land and the animals almost as well as James. She had learned to love the vast emptiness, the endless sky, the sharp beauty of the desert. And she had learned to love her husband, not with the passionate intensity of a romance novel but with something deeper and more lasting: respect, affection, partnership, and genuine friendship. One evening in late October, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, James took her hand. "I have been thinking," he said, "we should expand the house. Add on a couple more rooms." "Why would we need more rooms?" Caroline asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "Well, I am hoping we might need a nursery before too long," James said, a flush creeping up his neck. "Unless you do not want children, we have never really talked about it." Caroline smiled and placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "I think we might need that nursery sooner than you thought. I was going to tell you tonight. I am fairly certain I am with child." James's face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, wonder, and then pure happiness. He pulled her into his arms and held her close, his face buried in her hair. "Truly, you are sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor, but all the signs are there. Martha said she thought I might be when I saw her last week, and I have been counting the days. I think the baby will come sometime in late spring." They sat together in the gathering darkness, wrapped in each other's arms, talking about the future. James wanted to build more corrals, expand the herd, perhaps hire another hand. Caroline wanted to add a proper garden, maybe get a milk cow, definitely improve the chicken coop. They talked about names for the baby, about how their lives would change, about all the hopes and dreams they had for the family they were building together. Winter was mild that year, with only a few hard freezes and no snow at the ranch itself, though the mountains were capped with white throughout the coldest months. Caroline grew steadily rounder, her belly swelling with the child inside. James was solicitous to the point of being annoying, constantly worried that she was working too hard or doing too much. But Caroline was healthy and strong, and she continued managing the household and helping with the lighter ranch work well into her pregnancy. The baby came on a warm day in May, arriving with surprising speed after a labor that, while painful, was mercifully short. Martha Henderson served as midwife, and her calm competence saw Caroline through the worst of it. When the baby finally emerged, wailing and red-faced, Martha cleaned him off and placed him in Caroline's arms. "A boy," Martha announced with satisfaction. "A fine, healthy boy." James, who had been pacing outside the bedroom for the past 3 hours, burst through the door at the sound of the baby's cry. His face was pale and drawn, and he looked like he might faint when he saw Caroline lying exhausted in the bed with a tiny bundle in her arms. "Is she all right?" he demanded, looking at Martha rather than Caroline. "Is the baby all right?" "We are both fine," Caroline said, her voice hoarse but happy. "Come meet your son." James approached the bed slowly, as if afraid he might break something. He looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket, and his expression softened into something Caroline had never seen before: pure, uncomplicated love. "He is so small," James whispered, touching one tiny hand with his finger. The baby's fingers curled reflexively around his, and James's eyes filled with tears. "He is perfect. You are perfect. I cannot believe we made this." They named him Thomas, after James's father, and called him Tommy. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's blue eyes and what looked like it might become his mother's dark hair. James was a devoted father, spending every free moment with his son, holding him, talking to him, showing him around the ranch as if the infant could understand anything about cattle or horses or desert landscape. Caroline had never seen her husband so happy. The ranch was doing well, the cattle were thriving, and now they had a son to build a future for. Life was not easy exactly. The work was hard, the environment unforgiving, and there were plenty of challenges and setbacks. But they faced them together, as partners and equals, and somehow that made everything bearable. By the time Tommy was 6 months old, Caroline knew she was pregnant again. This baby came the following spring, a daughter they named Sarah after Caroline's mother. She had dark hair like Caroline and James's blue eyes, and from the moment she was born, she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger. 2 children in 3 years, Martha said with a laugh when she came to visit a few weeks after Sarah's birth. You are not wasting any time building that family. I always wanted a house full of children, Caroline admitted, watching as James played with both Tommy and baby Sarah in the main room. Growing up alone in my aunt's boarding house, I used to dream about having brothers and sisters. Now I can give my children what I never had. The years flowed by, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. The ranch expanded steadily as James built up the herd and acquired more land. They added onto the house as planned, creating a proper nursery and an extra bedroom that would be needed when another baby arrived 2 years after Sarah. This one was another boy, named William but called Billy from the start. Caroline had worried that 3 children might be overwhelming, but she found she thrived in the chaos of a large family. The house that had seemed so empty and masculine when she first saw, it was now filled with toys and laughter and the constant noise of children growing up. She taught them to read before they were old enough for school, told them stories of Philadelphia and the very different world she had left behind, raised them to be kind and honest and hardworking. James was a wonderful father, patient and loving but firm when needed. He taught the boys to ride and rope and work cattle. He taught Sarah that girls could do anything boys could do, much to the dismay of some of the more traditional ranch wives. He made sure all 3 children knew they were loved and valued, that they were the most important thing in his and Caroline's world. When Tommy was 10 years old and already showing signs of becoming as tall as his father, he asked Caroline about how she and James had met. They were sitting on the porch snapping beans for dinner, with Sarah and Billy playing in the yard under the watchful eye of her ranch dog James had brought home as a puppy years ago. Well, Caroline said slowly, wondering how much to tell him. Your father and I had what they call a correspondence courtship. We wrote letters to each other before I came to Arizona. But you did not know each other before you got married, Tommy asked, his blue eyes wide with curiosity. No, we did not, Caroline admitted. It was strange and frightening at first. But your father was very patient and kind, and we took the time to get to know each other properly before we married. Were you scared? Tommy asked. Caroline thought about that long-ago day in the church in Prescott, about the tears that would not stop falling, about James's steady voice telling her they could wait. Yes, she said honestly. I was very scared. Coming to a new place to marry someone you have never met is a frightening thing, but it turned out to be the best decision I ever made. Tommy seemed satisfied with this answer and went back to snapping beans. But Caroline found herself thinking about those early days more and more as the years passed. How close she had come to running away, to letting fear control her choices. How lucky she was that James had been the man he was, kind and patient and willing to give her time. She watched him now, out in the corral with Billy, teaching his youngest son to rope a practice dummy. He was older now, his dark hair showing threads of gray at the temples, his face more weathered by years of sun and wind. But he was still the steady, strong man she had married, still the person she trusted most in the world. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Caroline and James sat together on their bed, talking about the day and making plans for tomorrow. It was their routine, these quiet conversations at the end of each day, a time when they reconnected and reminded each other why they had chosen this life together. "Tommy asked me today about how we met," Caroline said, leaning against James's shoulder. "What did you tell him?" "The truth, mostly. That we wrote letters, that I came here to marry you, that I was scared at first, but that it all worked out." James was quiet for a moment, his arm around her shoulders. "I have never properly thanked you, for giving me that second chance, for not running away after what happened at the church." "You have thanked me every single day with the way you treat me," Caroline said. "With the life we have built together, I am the one who should be thanking you. You saw me at my worst, crying and falling apart, and instead of judging me, you showed me kindness. That changed everything." "I was terrified you would decide you had made a mistake," James admitted. "That you would get back on that stagecoach and return to Philadelphia. I think that week before we went to Tucson was the longest week of my life." Caroline turned to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes even after all these years. "I have never regretted coming here, not for a single moment. This life, this family, it is everything I never knew I wanted." They held each other in the lamplight, two people who had started as strangers and had become so much more. Partners, lovers, best friends, parents. They had built something real and lasting from nothing but hope and determination and a willingness to take a chance on each other. More years passed, bringing more changes. Tommy grew tall and strong, taking on more responsibility at the ranch. Sarah proved to have a head for numbers and began managing the ranch accounts when she was just 14. Billy, the youngest, showed a talent for working with horses and spent hours training the new colts James brought in each year. When Tommy was 18, he announced he wanted to go to the university in Tucson to study agriculture and animal husbandry. James was initially resistant, wanting his eldest son to stay and help run the ranch, but Caroline talked him around. "Let him go," she said. "Let him learn and grow. He will come back with knowledge that will help the ranch thrive." She was right, as usual. Tommy returned 2 years later with a head full of new ideas about breeding programs and land management. He also returned with a young woman named Elizabeth, a rancher's daughter he had met in Tucson. They were married the following spring in the same church in Prescott, where Caroline and James had failed to marry all those years ago. Caroline stood in that church watching her son pledge his life to his bride, and she felt the weight of time and memory pressing on her. She thought of the frightened young woman she had been, crying so hard she could not speak her vows. She thought of James stopping the ceremony, giving her the time and space she needed. She thought of all the years since then, all the joy and sorrow and hard work and love that had filled their lives. James took her hand as they listened to Tommy and Elizabeth speak their vows, and Caroline squeezed his fingers gently. They did not need words anymore to communicate what they meant to each other. The simple touch was enough. Sarah surprised everyone by announcing she wanted to become a teacher like Miss Ellis, who had finally retired after 30 years of teaching Prescott's children. She took over the schoolhouse at age 19, the youngest teacher the town had ever had, and proved herself more than capable. She married at 22, choosing a steady young lawyer from a good family who clearly adored her fierce intelligence and strong will. Billy, true to his nature, stayed close to home, taking on more and more of the daily running of the ranch as James grew older. He married a sweet girl from a neighboring ranch, and they built a house on the far side of the McAllister property, close enough to help but far enough to have their own space. Caroline and James became grandparents, and then grandparents again, and then again. Their house was always full of children and grandchildren, noise and laughter, and the happy chaos of a large, loving family. They watched their children build their own lives and families, passing on the values of hard work and integrity that had been the foundation of their own marriage. One evening, when Caroline was 52 years old and James was approaching 60, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, as they had done thousands of times before. The desert was painted in shades of gold and red, and the mountains stood purple against the darkening sky. "Do you ever think about Philadelphia?" James asked suddenly. "About what your life would have been like if you had stayed?" Caroline considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I cannot imagine that life anymore. It feels like it happened to someone else. This is my life right here, this ranch, this family, everything that matters to me is here." "I think about that day sometimes," James said quietly. "When you got off the stagecoach and I saw you for the first time. You looked so frightened and brave at the same time. I wanted to protect you, even though I did not know you at all. And then I ruined everything by crying at the altar," Caroline said with a laugh. "You did not ruin anything," James said firmly. "You were honest about your feelings, and you gave us a chance to really know each other before we committed our lives. If we had gone through with the ceremony that day, we would have been strangers living in the same house. Instead, we took the time to build something real." "We can do this another day," Caroline quoted softly. "Those were the words that changed my life. You gave me permission to be scared, to take my time, to not be perfect. No one had ever done that for me before." James pulled her close, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. They did not need to say anything else. Everything that needed to be said had been said over the course of their long life together. More years flowed by, marked by the changing seasons and the growing family. James's hair turned completely gray, and he moved a bit slower than he used to, complaining about his joints on cold mornings. Caroline developed laugh lines around her eyes and silver threads in her dark hair. But they were still the same two people at their core, still partners in everything they did. When James was 65, he began to talk about stepping back from the day-to-day running of the ranch. Billy was more than capable of taking over, and Tommy's innovations had made the ranch more profitable than ever. It was time, James said, to enjoy the fruits of their labor, to spend time with their grandchildren, to simply be together without the constant pressure of work. They did not retire completely. James would never be the type of man to sit idle while there was work to be done. But they took more time for themselves, for long rides through the desert they had loved for so many years, for quiet evenings on the porch, for visits with their children and grandchildren. One afternoon in spring, when Caroline was 60 and James was nearing 68, they rode out to the canyon with the spring that had always been James's favorite place on the ranch. The cottonwoods were bright green with new leaves, and wildflowers dotted the ground. They sat on the same flat rock where they had sat so many years ago, when they were still getting to know each other, still uncertain about their future together. "Do you remember sitting here all those years ago?" James asked, taking her hand. "When I told you I wanted to share my life with someone?" "I remember," Caroline said softly. "I remember thinking that maybe, just maybe, this could work, that maybe we could build something real together." "We did," James said simply. "We built a good life, Caroline, a really good life." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the water burble over the stones. Caroline found herself thinking about all the twists and turns that had brought her to this moment. The fire that had destroyed her aunt's boarding house, the desperate decision to answer a mail-order bride advertisement, the terror of standing at the altar beside a stranger. James's kindness in stopping the ceremony, the slow building of trust and affection and love. "If you could go back," Caroline said suddenly, "and talk to that frightened girl getting off the stagecoach in Prescott, what would you tell her?" James thought about it for a moment. "I would tell her that everything is going to be all right, better than all right. I would tell her that she is stronger than she thinks, braver than she knows. And I would tell her that the tall cowboy waiting on the church steps is going to love her for the rest of his life. Caroline felt tears prick her eyes, but these were happy tears, grateful tears. And if I could talk to that cowboy on the church steps, what would you tell him? I would tell him that his kindness matters. That giving that scared girl time to breathe, time to know him, time to trust him, is the best gift he could ever give her. I would tell him that she is going to love him more than she ever thought possible. And I would tell him that their life together is going to be better than any dream either of them ever had. James leaned over and kissed her gently, sweetly. A kiss that held 43 years of love and partnership and shared life. When they broke apart, both were smiling, their eyes bright with tears and happiness. They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, and Caroline looked around at the land she had come to love so deeply. The house they had built and expanded together. The barn where Billy was working with a new colt. The corrals where cattle moved peacefully in the fading light. The vegetable garden she tended every spring. The cottonwood tree they had planted the year Tommy was born, now tall and strong and providing shade for grandchildren to play under. This was home. This was family. This was the life she had built with the man riding beside her, the man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and had responded with kindness rather than judgment. The man who had given her time when she needed it most. The man who had become her partner, her best friend, her love. That night, lying in bed with James's arms around her, Caroline thought about all the women who might be facing the same choice she had faced all those years ago. Women who were desperate or frightened or simply looking for a new start. She hoped they would be as lucky as she had been. She hoped they would find men like James, men who understood that marriage was a partnership, that love could grow from respect and time spent together, that kindness mattered more than anything else. As she drifted off to sleep, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the life she had been given, for the chances she had taken, for the day she had stepped off a stagecoach in Arizona territory and into a future she could never have imagined. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow as all years do. James's health began to decline when he was in his early 70s, his strong body finally showing the effects of decades of hard work. Caroline nursed him through a bout of pneumonia one winter, sitting by his bedside for 3 days and nights until the fever finally broke. He recovered, but he was never quite as strong afterward, content to sit on the porch and watch the grandchildren play rather than working alongside Billy in the corrals. Caroline remained healthy and active well into her 60s, still managing the household, still tending her garden, still the center around which the family revolved. Her children and grandchildren came to her with their problems and their triumphs, seeking her wisdom and her comfort. She had become the matriarch of a large, thriving family, respected and loved by everyone who knew her. On a warm day in June, when Caroline was 68 and James was 75, the entire family gathered at the ranch to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary. All 3 of their children were there with their spouses and children. Tommy and Elizabeth had 5 children, all grown now, with 2 already married and starting families of their own. Sarah and her husband had 4 children, and Billy and his wife had 3. The ranch was overflowing with people, 3 generations of McAllisters filling the house and yard with noise and laughter. They held the celebration outside, setting up tables under the cottonwood tree and cooking enough food to feed an army. There were speeches and toasts, stories and laughter, music and dancing. Caroline stood beside James, his arm around her waist, and looked at all the faces surrounding them. These were the people they had created together, the legacy they would leave behind. Not just the ranch, substantial as it was, but this family, these bonds of love and loyalty that would outlast both of them. Tommy stood to give a speech, raising his glass in a toast. To my parents, who have shown us all what a real marriage looks like. Who have worked side by side for 50 years, building this ranch and this family with their own hands. Who have loved each other through good times and bad, through sickness and health, exactly as they promised all those years ago. We are all here because of you, because of the love you share and the life you built together. Thank you for everything you have given us. Everyone raised their glasses and cheered, and Caroline felt James's arm tighten around her waist. She looked up at him and saw tears streaming down his weathered face, and her own eyes filled in response. Later, when the celebration had wound down and the grandchildren were sleeping in various bedrooms and corners of the house, Caroline and James walked together to the porch. They sat in the rocking chairs they had occupied for so many evenings, holding hands and looking out at the desert night. 50 years, James said wonderingly. It seems like yesterday that I was standing on those church steps waiting for the stagecoach, and at the same time, it feels like we have been together forever. I know exactly what you mean, Caroline said. Time is strange that way, but I would not change a single moment of it. Well, maybe I would have preferred not to cry so much at our first wedding attempt. James laughed, that deep, warm sound she had loved for so many years. Those tears were a gift, Caroline. They gave us the time we needed to really know each other. If you had been able to go through with the ceremony that day, we might have had a very different marriage. A good one, perhaps, but not what we have had, not this partnership, this deep friendship. You are right, Caroline acknowledged, though I did not feel that way at the time. I felt like I was ruining everything, disappointing everyone. You were being honest, James said simply. That is never wrong. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert. The distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of something small moving through the brush, the soft lowing of cattle settling down for the night. I have been thinking, James said eventually, about what comes next. We are not getting any younger, Caroline. I want to make sure you are taken care of, that you have everything you need. I have everything I need right here, Caroline said firmly. This family, this home, nothing else matters. Still, I have been working with Sarah's husband on some legal matters. Making sure the ranch is properly set up so Billy can take over without any complications. Making sure you will have enough to live on comfortably. Making sure all the children are provided for fairly. Caroline squeezed his hand. You are a good man, James McAllister, the best man I have ever known. I am just a cowboy who got lucky enough to marry way above his station, James said with a smile. You are so much more than that, Caroline said. You are the man who saw a frightened woman crying at the altar and responded with kindness. You are the man who built this ranch from nothing. You are the man who has been my partner and my best friend for 50 years. You are the man I love more than life itself. James pulled her close, and they sat together in the darkness. Two people who had become one through time and shared experience, and a love that had grown deeper with every passing year. James lived another 3 years, dying peacefully in his sleep one autumn night when he was 78 years old. Caroline found him in the morning, lying beside her in the bed they had shared for half a century, looking peaceful and younger somehow without the burden of life weighing on him. She sat with him for a long time before calling for the family, memorizing his face one last time, saying goodbye to the man who had been her whole world for so long. The funeral was one of the largest Prescott had ever seen. James had been respected throughout the territory for his integrity and fairness, and people came from hundreds of miles away to pay their respects. Caroline stood surrounded by her children and grandchildren, accepting condolences with grace and dignity, though inside she felt like she had been hollowed out and left empty. The first few months after James's death were the hardest. Caroline wandered through the house they had shared, seeing him everywhere, expecting him to walk through the door at any moment. She slept poorly, waking in the night reaching for him and finding only emptiness. She made his coffee in the morning out of habit before remembering he was not there to drink it. But she was not alone. Her children and grandchildren rallied around her, making sure she was never isolated for too long, giving her space to grieve but also pulling her back into life when she threatened to withdraw too far. Billy and his family moved into the main house with her, filling it with noise and activity that helped ease the silence. Slowly, painfully, Caroline learned to live with the loss. She found comfort in the memories they had made together, in the stories her grandchildren begged her to tell about their grandfather, in the life they had built that continued even without him. She remained active in the community, helping at the school, tending her garden, participating in the church activities she had been involved with for decades. One spring morning, 2 years after James's death, Caroline rode out to the canyon with the spring. She had not been there since his death, unable to face the memories without him beside her. But on this day, something drew her there, a need to remember and to say a proper goodbye. She sat on the flat rock where they had sat so many times over the years, listening to the water burble over the stones, breathing in the cool air rising from the stream. She thought about the first time they had come here together, when they were still getting to know each other, still uncertain about their future. She thought about all the times they had returned over the years, using this place as a refuge when they needed to reconnect or think or simply be together away from the demands of ranch life. "I miss you," she said aloud, speaking to the empty air as if James could hear her. "Every single day I miss you, but I am grateful too. Grateful for every moment we had together, for the life we built, for the love we shared. You gave me everything I never knew I wanted. You saw me at my worst and loved me anyway. You were patient when I needed patience, strong when I needed strength, and always, always kind." She sat for a long time, feeling the sun warm on her face, listening to the birds singing in the cottonwoods. And slowly, gradually, she felt a sense of peace settling over her. James was gone, but he was not really gone. He was in the ranch they had built together. He was in the children and grandchildren they had raised. He was in her memories, in her heart, woven into the very fabric of her being so completely that he could never be truly lost. Caroline lived another 15 years after James's death, dying peacefully at the age of 85, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. In her final days, she spoke often of James, of their life together, of the love that had sustained her through so many years. And as she lay dying, her last words were a whisper, "Wait for me, James. We can do this together." The McAllister Ranch continued to thrive under Billy's management and later under his children. The house that Caroline and James had built was expanded again to accommodate new generations. The land that James had claimed and worked and loved continued to sustain the family he had founded. And the story of the mail-order bride who could not stop crying at the altar, and the cowboy who gave her time to heal, was passed down through the generations as a testament to the power of kindness, patience, and love that grows slowly and lasts forever. In the family cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch, 2 headstones stood side by side, marking the final resting place of James and Caroline McAllister. Visitors to the ranch, whether family members or curious tourists, often stopped at those graves to read the inscriptions and hear the story of how a frightened woman from Philadelphia and a lonely cowboy from Texas built something beautiful together in the Arizona desert. The story had become a legend in the family, told and retold to each new generation. About how Caroline had stepped off that stagecoach in Prescott in 1882, about how she had broken down at the altar, about how James had stopped the ceremony and given her time. About how they had taken that time to really know each other, to build a foundation of friendship and respect before pledging their lives to each other. About how what started as a business arrangement between strangers had become a love story for the ages. The youngest great-great-grandchildren, hearing the story for the first time, would ask if it was true, if their ancestors had really met that way. And the older family members would nod and point to the graves on the hill and say yes, it was all true, every word of it. Because the best love stories, they would say, are not about love at first sight or grand romantic gestures. They are about two people choosing each other every single day. They are about patience and kindness and the willingness to give someone time to heal. They are about building something together, brick by brick, year by year, until you look around one day and realize you have created something beautiful and lasting. That was what James and Caroline had done. Two strangers who became partners, then friends, then lovers, then the very foundation upon which a family dynasty was built. Two people who took a chance on each other when everything was uncertain, who chose trust over fear, who gave each other the gift of time. And in the end, time was what they had together. 50 years of marriage, 68 years of Caroline's life intertwined with James's, and a legacy that would last for generations beyond their deaths. Not a bad outcome for a mail-order bride who could not stop crying and a cowboy who said they could do it another day. The desert wind blew across the ranch, carrying the scent of sage and dust and the promise of monsoon rains to come. In the main house, children laughed and played, carrying on the family traditions. In the corrals, cattle moved peacefully, descendants of the herds James had so carefully built. And on the hill, two headstones stood together, marking the place where two people rested side by side, together in death as they had been in life. Their story was not forgotten. It would never be forgotten, because some love stories are too powerful, too true, too beautiful to ever fade away. And the story of James and Caroline McAllister, of the tears that almost ended their marriage before it began, and the kindness that gave it time to flourish, was one of those stories that would be told and retold as long as there were McAllisters to tell it. It was a story about courage and vulnerability, about fear and hope, about the power of seeing someone at their most broken and choosing compassion over judgment. It was a story about building a life together one day at a time, about partnership and respect and love that deepens with every shared sunset, every overcome challenge, every quiet moment of connection. Most of all, it was a story about second chances, about what can happen when someone gives you the time and space to find your footing, about how the greatest acts of love are sometimes the smallest ones. A gentle voice saying, "We can do this another day," a patient hand held steady, a willingness to wait until the other person is ready. That was the true legacy of James and Caroline McAllister. Not just the ranch or the family or the material success, though those were all impressive in their own right. But the example they set of what a marriage could be, what a partnership should be, what love looks like when it is given time to grow deep roots. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go when bodies die, Caroline and James were together again, riding through desert canyons under endless blue skies. Sitting together watching sunsets paint the world in gold and amber, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing. Together as they had always been meant to be, from that first moment on the church steps in Prescott, Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1882, when a mail-order bride could not stop crying, and a cowboy said the words that would change both their lives forever. "We can do this another day."